Time to sail across the Atlantic Division, and our first stop, Boston.
You're Locked On Sabres, your daily podcast on the Buffalo Sabres. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And thanks for making Locked On Sabres your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on our YouTube channel. So be sure to check us out there. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day at Sneaky Joe Sports. If you would like to follow me on Twitter or get involved with the show that way, of course, you can do it on our station or a podcast account, Locked On Sabres, or on our YouTube channel. You can reply under one of our videos, and we're always loving reading some of those on the show. So thanks again for everybody getting involved as they normally do. Mailbag questions are always welcome, of course, and sometimes, like our last show, it can even create the theme of the show. Today, though, I've got a little announcement to get your way in a moment for a fun thing that we're going to be doing in the next couple weeks here on the show. And then we'll get to the Boston Bruins. We're going to go team by team in the Atlantic Division and really dive into their off seasons. Did they get better? Did they get worse? Did the Sabres pass them? Did they get close? How close? So we're going to start today with the number one team in the division, the defending Atlantic Division champions, the defending President's Trophy champions, the Boston Bruins. So we'll dive into Boston today, what they lost, what they gained, what their lineup looks like, and how close the Sabres are to them. That's coming up today here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. Couple of comments, though, I wanted to read on the show, stemming from our last episode. If you missed it, we really dove in on the Rasmus Dahlin and Owen Power contract extensions, which we are still waiting for. July 12th now, still nothing. We're not in a big rush, but nothing yet on either one of those contracts. One comment from Cool Guy 2DC, what is great about Dahlin is that he still has growth left, unlike some other high-end defensemen in the league. A lot of those guys, maybe you'd think known commodities. Maybe he's talking about Erik Karlsson, maybe Adam Fox even a little bit. I'm not sure exactly who he means, but I get the point. I think Dahlin can still get a little bit better. Beige Janitor replies, he loves some of these usernames, assuming $10 million for Dahlin, $7 million times 8 years is about as far as I'd go for Power prior to the season starting. The likelihood of him outperforming that contract is enough to offset the risk of a long contract based on this few games played. I hear you. I'd be much more willing to go up to $8 million, $9 million a year even, because despite the fact that I think you're probably right, maybe Power at this moment is a $7 million defenseman, but he's a number one overall pick. I do think you should treat him differently and treat projections of him differently because he was a number one overall pick. Maybe that's not the smartest way to do things as a rule of thumb, but I don't know. When you have a guy that was this good as a rookie and he was a number one pick, a surefire top guy, I think all the signs are pointing to he's going to be a dominant player. So I can't see him ever being a $7 million defenseman again in terms of his impact until he's, in his late 30s. So I hear you, but I personally would be willing to go up to 8 or 9 million. Okay, let's get into the Boston Bruins. We're going to sail across the Atlantic Division team by team. We'll get to those teams down at the bottom, have the Sabres kind of, widen the gap between them. But the teams above them, I really want to get to the core question, which is, have the Sabres passed this team? And if not, how close have they gotten to closing the gap? And we're going to start today with the Boston Bruins on the heels of the greatest regular season that any NHL team has ever seen. 82 games played, 65 wins, only 12 losses, 5 overtime losses, 135 points. That is the most points by an NHL team in NHL history. That is the most wins by a team in NHL history. Both records. Then they got to the playoffs. They got up 3-1 on the Florida Panthers, the eventual Eastern Conference champions, and lost to Florida in a Game 7 on home ice and saw their historic season come to an end in dramatic fashion with an overtime winning goal by the Florida Panthers. It was close. And, they maybe almost weren't even going to play the Panthers. Remember, the Sabres only missed the playoffs by 1 point. The Penguins only missed the playoffs by 1 point. If either Buffalo or Pittsburgh had squeaked in instead of Florida, I believe that Boston would have got through the first round. And personally, I believe they would have went all the way to the finals. The way the playoffs shaped up, I think the winner of that first round series, Florida and Boston, was the team that was going to go all the way. It's a lot of projection, saying that Boston would have had to win 3 more rounds. But they almost did it, by the way. They had Florida on the ropes, less than 2 minutes to play in Game 7, and Boston was up. But a huge game-tying goal by, I believe, Brandon Montour in Game 7 tied it. And then Brad Marchand, remember, had a breakaway with less than 10 seconds to play in regulation to win the game, and a huge save by Sergei Bobrovsky sent it to overtime. They came this close to getting past Florida on a multitude of different multitude of times. So you can indict them if you want for that season. To me, they were a historically great team, but it's hockey. Hockey is a crapshoot when you get to the playoffs. If you run into a hot goalie and you run into a hot team, then anybody can lose. Anybody can lose to anybody. And Florida, President's Trophy champions from the year before, we kind of knew was a team that was better than just an 8 seed. They had just had a down year. And they really proved that, of course, as they ran their way through the East in the playoffs. So, all right, what about that season for Boston? How good really was it? Was it fluky in any way? Well, if you look at some of the advanced numbers, fluky is not the right word. Inflated, were they as good as the best team we've ever seen? Probably not. They probably are not the greatest hockey team of all time, but even though they're going to have the record for wins and points. Expected goals for, they finished 8th in the league. Still great. Great team. One of the best. And if you combine that with what they got out of their goaltenders, you could argue still that they were the best team in the league, but their numbers at 5-on-5, remember they had a great power play as well, but their numbers at 5-on-5 were 8th. So despite the fact that their point totals lapped the field, were significantly above anybody else, the Bruins won the President's Trophy by 18 points. Were they 18 points better than everybody else? No, they were not. And what that usually means in the NHL is regression to the mean. And especially when it comes to the President's Trophy winner. And I'll get to that in a little bit. That's going to be more part of our third segment when we'll have the Sabres close the gap or past Boston. I got some numbers for you on President's Trophy winners and how they've regressed year by year. Kind of a good way to guess at what we've got for Boston. But in terms of subtractions and additions, we'll get to that when we come back. Who they've lost, who they've gained, and what it means for their lineup and their odds of winning again in a big way in 2023-24. That's coming up here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. We are presented by Birddogs. I am a big golfer, and if you know me or listen to me enough, you know I'm really into golf clothing. I'm all about the polos. I've got getting a new one all the time. Love the different prints, love the different patterns, and I'm also huge on my golf joggers and my golf shorts, and there is no better place to look than Birddogs. I mean, for golf joggers, those have replaced dress pants for me, or like khaki pants. I'm wearing golf joggers, and I'm wearing my Birddogs, whether I've got a navy pair, I've got a khaki pair, olive green, a million different options for colors if you're looking for golf joggers themselves. But Birddogs makes you look good. In stretch khaki shorts designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. Birddog shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They fit way better than regular shorts that are made of that stiff, restricting cotton. Birddogs fixed this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki, but it stretches so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Birddogs also uses anti-stink, sweat, wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. I know we had some real hot summer days here in Buffalo in the past couple of days. So go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter the promo code LockedOnNHL for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. So that's birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or promo code LockedOnNHL for free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off, we promise you. Sneaky Joe DiBiase back on the Locked On Sabres podcast. What's going on with the Boston Bruins? How did their offseason go? Additions and subtractions. Let's start with subtractions for the Boston Bruins. One with a big question mark on whether or not it is an actual subtraction. But starting with some of their other subtractions on the year before I get to Patrice Bergeron, if you can't tell who I'm talking about. Tyler Bertuzzi goes to the Toronto Maple Leafs, a mid-season addition for Boston, but a very good player, middle six winger that produced pretty nicely for the Boston Bruins. Tyler Bertuzzi is out. Taylor Hall on a cap dump trade is out. Nick Foligno, same thing, same trade actually, to Chicago with Taylor Hall, out. David Krejci, now this one's a little bit of a maybe, but it sounds like he's going back to the Czech Republic, Czechia, and is going to kind of get ready for the World Championships. He wants to play for Czechia in the World Championships, and maybe that'll be it for him. Well, the World Championships take place at the same time as the Stanley Cup playoffs. So the fact that he said that, I think points to he doesn't want to play in the NHL because he's not going to play the regular season and then skip the playoffs. I mean, he's not going to do that. And Dmitry Orlov, another subtraction for Boston, a deadline acquisition nonetheless, but did help them down the stretch of the season. And Connor Clifton, who comes to Buffalo as a third pair defenseman. He was playing in that role for most of the year for Boston. They lose a very good third pair guy as well. And the numbers on some of these guys, I mean, some of these guys really did produce. Tyler Bertuzzi, only 21 games played, mid-season addition, but 16 points for Tyler Bertuzzi. Dmitry Orlov played 23 games for Boston. He had 17 points on the back end. Taylor Hall had a down year. So they're losing some production with Hall, but he was having a down year. 16 goals, 36 points, and 61 games played for Hall. David Krejci had a nice year, 56 points in 70 games. So came back to the NHL. He is an older player, but he was still a productive player for Boston. But the big name that they are going to be missing the most, if he indeed leaves and hangs up the skates, is Patrice Bergeron. Bergeron, little bit of a down year in terms of the offensive production, 27 goals, 58 points, great goal scorer, but still an elite defensive forward, won the Selke Trophy. Again, the award needs to really be renamed the Patrice Bergeron. He is the biggest loss. And the biggest reason why, and I'll get to this a little bit with their additions, he really leaves a gaping hole down the middle of the ice. Additions for the Bruins this year, and who might be a replacement for Bergeron. To me, there really isn't a good answer to that question. Additions: Morgan Geekie, who is a center. Milan Lucic, that's kind of just like isn't that kind of a, hey, it's our 100th season, which, by the way, it is Boston's 100th season. They changed their logo to the yellow bee, back to that. I think it looks pretty sharp. Didn't they sign Lucic because it's their 100th year and they thought it'd be cool to bring him back? James Van Riemsdyk is an addition for the Bruins, as is Jesper Boquist. That actually happened today on Wednesday that they signed Jesper Boquist. These are not great players. I mean, Morgan Geekie, for instance, third year in the league, third year in the league. Last year for Seattle, 9 goals, 19 assists for 28 points. Okay, that is not your Patrice Bergeron replacement. Okay, what about Jesper Boquist? Because he's played a bunch of center in the NHL. Okay, 10 goals, 11 assists for 21 points. That's not your Bergeron replacement. So these guys, Geekie and Boquist are kind of nice bottom six guys. Lucic and JVR are over the hill. So I don't like those moves. What did they really add? They didn't really replace anything they lost. Bertuzzi, Hall, Krejci, Orlov, Bergeron, Clifton, they didn't really replace any of them. And that's because they didn't have any cap space to do so. They had to pay David Pastrnak. And there's another quandary out there for the Bruins, and that is Jeremy Swayman. So they have Linus Ullmark. He won the Vezina Trophy, incredible goaltender. You probably should be right, by the way, in expecting some saves percentage regression from Linus Ullmark. I don't think he's going to do what he just did again. It's too hard to maintain it. So some goalie regression coming. Jeremy Swayman is also a really good goaltender for the Boston Bruins. Young, very talented. He had one of the best save percentage in hockey, third in the league in goals saved above expected. Ullmark was number one. And he played 37 games. Like, he gets a workload. He's an RFA. He's going to arbitration. What's that contract going to look like? And are they going to make it ugly? And could there be an exit at some point? I don't think that's going to happen, but they got to figure out Swayman. And they also have Trent Frederick, who's a decent player in the middle of their lineup. Frederick last year, 17 goals in 79 games played in the bottom six. So nice little, production there from him. He's going to get something as well. He's an RFA. And they have another RFA, defenseman Ian Mitchell. They have $6.7 million in cap space, $6.9 million in cap space. That's going to eat up all of that. So doesn't that mean they're not bringing back Patrice Bergeron? Or if they are, they got to move someone off the team. And I don't really know if there's an obvious answer for who that is. They already made those moves by, dumping off Taylor Hall and James Van Riemsdyk. So one of two things is going to happen. Those RFAs are not all going to get contracts. And two of those are important restricted free agents, Jeremy Swayman and Trent Frederick. Or Bergeron's done. And I might lean that way. I might guess that Bergeron is done. We talked to, on WGR a couple weeks ago, a Bruins reporter, and Scott McLaughlin from Odyssey in Boston. And I asked him about Bergeron and his odds of coming back, and he said it's about 50-50 right now. So I don't know. It could very well happen that Patrice Bergeron is done. Where are the Bruins if they don't have Bergeron? Well, here's their four centers right now projected by Daily Faceoff. Pavel Zacha, Charlie Coyle, Morgan Geekie, and Jesper Boquist. You tell me who's a number one center on that team. Tell me who's a number two center on that team. That is a brutal center position. They lost their number one and their number two center. So you already have all these reasons for regression. Just the fact that they had an unsustainable record last year, an unsustainable save percentage for Ullmark, and they lost their number one and number two center. And that will lead us to our core question of, have the Sabres closed the gap with the Bruins? Kind of a crazy question considering where the two were last year in the standings, but I don't think it's a ridiculous one. Get to that when we come back here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. We are presented on Locked On Sabres by FanDuel Sportsbook. Take your first swing at Major League Baseball with FanDuel. And at FanDuel, you get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. How can you beat that? That's $200 you can spend on betting everything from the money line in a baseball game to the over-under to who you think is going to win the first home run to, hey, if you want to bet on the Sabres to win the Eastern Conference in the NHL. Or the Atlantic Division. Maybe that's a little bit more realistic. You can do that all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There is no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's number one sports book. So sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Sneaky Joe DiBiase here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. Before we get to whether or not the Sabres have closed the gap with the Bruins or how much they have, an announcement to get to. We are announcing a pretty exciting little series of shows that we're going to be putting together in the next couple of weeks. Locked On Sabres, or me and Locked On Sabres, I should say, are going to be getting together with the fellows over at the Charging Buffalo. And we are going to be an annual series, at least here on Locked On Sabres, that we're going to rotate with different people every year. This year, we're going to hook up with the guys at the Charging Buffalo. Next year, maybe it'll be somebody else. Lucas Buckley, Joe Marino from Charging Buffalo. There will be others included as well. We're going to do a Sabres super draft. We are going to have 4 teams. We are going to draft out of a player pool of all Buffalo Sabres of all time. and we're going to put teams together, and we're going to have you, the fans, vote, the listeners vote on who won, and we're also going to simulate these games on the NHL video game to see who has the best team. So this is going to be really exciting. We're gonna record the draft, of course, and we're going to put those out in the coming weeks, and I think it'll be a really exciting, fun show. So if you've got tips for me, because I'll be one of the drafters, you got tips for me on how I should pick, let me know. Whether you think like I should target goalie earlier with Hasek, or maybe I should, let that wait a little bit and just kind of wait until get like a Marty Baron or somebody later on. If you think I should go defense early, I don't even know who the defenseman would be. Housley maybe would be the first defenseman to be picked. Let me know if you got any tips or if you have any thoughts on how you would draft in a draft like this. But that's going to be a fun couple of shows that I'm really excited for, that we're going to be putting together for you, that'll come out in the next couple of weeks. So there's that. All right, back to the Boston Bruins. Have the Sabres close the gap with Boston? I labeled the way I'm going to want to label this question for the whole series of shows that we have on the Atlantic Division is have the Sabres pass this team. It almost sounds ridiculous, though, to say the Sabres have passed the Bruins. I'm not saying they have. Is it a ridiculous question, though? I just went through it. There's many reasons to believe there's regression coming. And they lost their number 1 and their number 2 centerman for the time being. We'll see if Bergeron actually has called it quits. And when it comes to that regression that you can just expect year to year, look at recent President's Trophy winners. Every year where we've had a full season the year after, or close to a full season, the President's Trophy winner has come way down in the standings. And it just happened this past season with the Florida Panthers. Florida wins the President's Trophy in 2022. And the next year they come back. After 122 points, they go down to 92, minus 30 points in the standings for Florida. Well, let's go back a couple years before that, skipping over that 56-game COVID season. What about Tampa Bay? Tampa Bay, remember, they set the NHL record for points in a season before Boston did this year with 128. Now, they also lost in the first round, but they had 128 points in the regular season in 2019 when they won the President's Trophy. The following year, that was stopped for COVID, but they got 70 games in, they were at 92 points. So if you project out where they were going to end up in 82 games, they were tracking towards about 110 points. And that's still great, but it's a minus 18. And if it wasn't that, maybe it would have been minus 16 or minus 14, but it would have went down double-digit points. How about Nashville? Nashville won the President's Trophy in 2018. They came back the next year after 117 points with 100. They went down 17 points. Washington, the year before that, went from 117 to 105, and so on and so forth. Every year, the President's Trophy is automatically going to have some regression. So that's going to happen for Boston on top of where they are right now with the center position. It is a dire need of the Bruins to figure out what they're going to do at center. Who is going to center David Pastrnak and Brad Marchand? Is it going to be Pavel Zacha? Pavel Zacha is not a bad hockey player, don't get me wrong. But a 21-goal scorer that had 57 points is your number 1 center, that's not a Stanley Cup contending team. Their blue line is still really good. Charlie McAvoy's a great number 1 defenseman. Matt Grzelcyk, Hampus Lindholm, Brandon Carlo. They have a great top 4. They did, by the way, I skipped over him in my additions earlier. They did add Kevin Shattenkirk for their third pair, so he'll help their third pair a little bit. And they still have one of the best goalie combos in the league with Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman, assuming they get Swayman figured out, which they should as a restricted free agent. So the team is still really nice all the way around. It's just the center. It's the centers. So when you look at the Sabres, I mean, Tage Thompson would easily be their number 1 center. Dylan Cousins would be their number 1 center. Hell, Casey Middlestat would be their number 1 center. I'm not sure Peyton Krebs wouldn't be their number 1 center. I'm not sure the Sabres don't have 4 centermen that are better than the Bruins' best center. Maybe I'm reaching a little bit with Krebs over Zacha, but I don't know. If you plugged Peyton Krebs into Pavel Zacha's role last year, could he have got 56 points? Because personally, I'm a big Krebs guy. I think he could have. So I will not say the Sabres have passed the Bruins. I will say it will be pretty close this year between the two. That the gap, which, I mean, if you're watching my YouTube channel right now, my hands are like outside the frame. That doesn't even fit in the frame, how wide apart my hands are. The gap between these two teams in the past couple of years, and even last year after the Sabres got so much better, it is the Atlantic Ocean. And now, maybe it's Lake Erie. You know, it's a little bit closer between the two. I expect the Bruins to be vulnerable. I think they're too talented to miss the playoffs outright, but I wouldn't want to guarantee that they'll get in. Someone's going to drop off, and they're as good a candidate as anybody because of their age and because of their current status at center. So, no, the Sabres have not passed the Bruins, but I do believe they have dramatically closed the gap. And not even by their own work. It's more just by the nature of Boston's situation. So the Bruins at 135. I don't know. I could see them very easily being like 100 to 102, 105. At like that's a good range for them. 100 to 105, I think, is very realistic for the Bruins this year. And I think the Sabres can catch that. I think the Sabres can get in that range themselves. All right, that's it for us today here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Next up on the show, we are going to go through the Toronto Maple Leafs. What did their offseason look like? And what does their future look like with Austin Matthews? Because it's July 12th, and he has still not signed a contract that he was eligible to sign on July 1st. So that will be next time here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. And the Sabres Super Draft is coming your way quickly here on the show, because I got to record it. I can't wait to do this thing. Maybe I'll talk more about my strategy going into it in the coming shows. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at Locked On Sabres and on our YouTube channel. Check us out there. Thanks for making Locked On Sabres your first listen every day. Every day is tomorrow on the show. Next time on the show, I should say. It's off season here. Maple Leafs. Have the Sabres passed the Leafs? Get to that next time.